The town of Redbone, Wyoming, called it a skills auction, which was the kind of name that made a degrading thing sound practical. It was held in the yard beside the county courthouse on the second Friday of the month. And it was not for children. It was for women, widows, mostly, and a few unmarried daughters of dead homesteaders, who had been determined by the county assessor's office to be without sufficient means to sustain themselves through winter. The county did not say they were being sold. The county said they were being placed in household service arrangements, which covered the administrative costs of their temporary housing and freed up the county from ongoing obligation. It was 1883 and October, and the mountains above Redbone had already gone white at the peaks, which meant the valley had 6 weeks, maybe 8, before the first hard freeze. Winifred Hale stood at the end of the row. She was 27 years old, and she was the last one left, which told its own story. She was not small or soft-looking the way the women who went first tended to be. She was angular and sun-darkened, and she stood with her arms at her sides and her chin level, and she had the look of someone who has been in difficult situations before and has developed a reliable method for surviving them, which is to say, she did not look like she needed saving, which meant most people did not think to save her. 3 families had come and gone. A rancher's wife who wanted someone to manage a kitchen, a feed merchant looking for help with his ledger work, a widow herself, which was an irony nobody commented on, who needed someone young enough to do the heavy work of a house that had grown beyond her management. Each of them had looked at Winifred Hale and looked away. She was too self-possessed, perhaps, too direct in the eyes. The kind of woman who does not make herself easy to overlook, which paradoxically made her easy to pass over. She watched each family go with an expression that gave nothing away. Not disappointment, not relief. Assessment. The county man, a round-faced fellow named Pruitt, who held his ledger like a shield, looked at her, and looked at his remaining column of names, and looked across the yard at the man who had been standing at the fence for the better part of an hour. "You here for placement?" Pruitt said, not expecting much. The man at the fence was named Gideon Marsh. He was 51 years old, a sheep rancher, who ran 400 head on a grazing lease in the foothills north of town, with a house that had been built for 2 people and currently held one, and with the specific quietness of a man who has organized his life very carefully around not needing things he cannot have. He had come to Redbone for flour and nails and lamp oil, and had stopped at the fence because the situation in the courthouse yard had the gravity of something he could not quite walk past. "What's her situation?" he said. Pruitt consulted the ledger with the efficiency of a man who has recited the same information many times and no longer hears it as a person's life. "Winifred Hale, husband died in June. Fluting on the Powder River. She's been in county housing since August. No family in the territory. Came up from Colorado originally." Gideon looked at the woman. The woman looked at Gideon. Her eyes were the color of creek water in November, gray-green and clear, and they were doing the same thing his eyes did in unfamiliar territory. Taking inventory, noting weight and distance and probable outcome. "The fee," he said. $3, Pruitt said, "covers her housing and the county's arrangement costs." Gideon reached into his coat. He was not entirely certain at the moment his hand found the coins what he was doing. He had a sheep ranch and no wife and enough work for 2 people and presently only himself to do it. He had no particular plan beyond that. But he paid the $3 with the straightforward motion of a man completing a transaction whose terms he has decided he can live with, and Pruitt wrote in his ledger, and Winifred Hale picked up the bag at her feet. It was not large, which told Gideon everything about the last 4 months of her life, and walked across the yard to where he was standing. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked at him with those creek-water eyes. "Where?" she said. One word. The question of someone who has dispensed with the unnecessary parts of language. "North," he said. "Sheep ranch, about 9 miles. "Sheep," she repeated with the tone of someone filing information. "You have experience?" "With cattle," she said. "And horses?" and a farm of 140 acres that I ran alone for 8 months after my husband broke his leg before the river took him." Gideon looked at her for a moment. "Then you know more than I thought you did." "Most people know more than they look like," she said. He did not have an answer for that, which was fine, because it had not been a question. They rode north in the wagon with the flour and nails and lamp oil, and Winifred sat on the bench beside him with her bag between her feet and watched the country go by with the attention of someone learning a new territory. It was good country, the kind that takes a while to reveal itself. Severe in the morning light, all gray stone and dry grass, and then the afternoon opened it up and showed the color underneath, the amber and rust of the November hills, the dark line of cottonwoods along the creek, the mountains going pink at the top as the sun came down. "It's good land," she said after a while. "It is," he said. "Lonely looking," she said, "but good." He glanced at her. "Most good things are." She said nothing to that, but she looked at the hills again with a slightly different quality of attention, as if she were revising something. He told her what he could about the work on the drive up. The grazing lease ran from April through November, and the flock wintered in the lower pastures with supplemental feed. There was a house, 2 rooms, with a separate outbuilding where the hand had slept before the hand quit in September. There were dogs, 3 of them, working dogs, not pets, though the distinction had blurred over time. There was a kitchen garden that had gone largely unmanaged since spring and would need attention before the ground froze if anything was to be salvaged. "I can do the garden," she said. "I wasn't asking you to." "I know," she said. "I'm telling you what I can do, not waiting to be asked." He looked at the road ahead. He had been alone for 4 years. He had forgotten what it was to have someone simply tell him things. She told him about Colorado on the drive, the way people tell things when they are in a moving vehicle and looking at the road and the proximity is close, but there is no requirement to look at each other. Her family had come from Ohio. Her father had been a schoolteacher who believed that land was the only real security and had spent his life acquiring small pieces of it and losing them to drought or market or bad timing. He had been, she said, a man of consistent optimism in the face of consistent evidence to the contrary, which she said with a kind of tired affection that was not unkindness. "And your husband?" Gideon said. A pause, not a painful one or not only painful, the pause of someone selecting the true summary. "Thomas was a good man," she said. "He worked hard and he was honest and he did not complain. He was not a man with much imagination for how things could be different than they were, but he was reliable, and I valued that. I valued it more after he was gone." "How long were you married?" 4 years, she said. 4 years, and he was dead in June, and I was in county housing by August. She said it flatly, without self-pity, the way you state a mathematical progression. The land was in his name. I couldn't hold it. Gideon said nothing for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "It's the law," she said. "I'm not interested in your sympathy for the law. I'm interested in what comes next." She paused. "That came out harder than I meant it." "No," he said. "It came out honest. There's a difference." She looked at him then, a sidelong look, brief and assessing, and then she looked back at the road. The ranch was 9 miles north, and it looked like what it was. A working place, without pretension or excess. The house was sound but plain. The outbuilding had a cot and a small iron stove and a window that faced east, which meant morning light, which was not nothing. The dogs came out to assess the newcomer with the thoroughness of working animals who understand that new people have to earn standing. The largest one, a gray merle named Soot, sat 3 feet from Winifred and stared at her with the yellow-eyed judgment of a creature who has reliable instincts and knows it. Winifred crouched down to the dog's level. She did not reach out or make sounds. She simply settled into the dog's eye line and waited. After 40 seconds, Gideon counted without meaning to. Soot walked forward and put his nose against her hand. "Good," Gideon said. "He's smart," Winifred said, standing. "Smart animals take longer, they're checking more." Gideon looked at her. "Where did you learn that?" "My father kept dogs," she said. "Before the land. And after, he always kept dogs." She settled in the outbuilding and took her meals in the kitchen and began, without being told to and without making a point of it, to do the work that was in front of her. The garden first, because the garden had a deadline that the other work did not. She salvaged the root vegetables, turnips and parsnips, and 2 types of squash that had survived the summer's neglect, and she put them up in the root cellar with an efficiency that suggested she had done it before, under worse conditions. She repaired the fence along the near pasture, not because Gideon had asked her to, but because she had walked the perimeter and identified it as the most immediate structural problem. He came back from the upper pasture one afternoon to find her mending the fence with the focused deliberateness of someone who has learned that the difference between a good job and a bad job is attention, and he stood at a distance for a moment before she heard him. "That wasn't part of the arrangement," he said. "The arrangement was household service," she said, without looking up from the wire. "This is the house's fence." He could not argue with the logic. He did not try. The trouble was this. Gideon had not planned for someone to be good at the work. He had planned for someone to be present, to cover the basic requirements of cooking and maintenance that had become unwieldy on his own. He had not planned for someone who looked at a problem and solved it before he'd finished identifying it, who fed the dogs with a consistency that had them sleeping calmer within the first week, who came in from the cold each evening smelling of wood smoke and turned dirt and stood at the kitchen stove with the self-possession of someone entirely at home in a place she had no claim to. He had also not planned for the conversations. They happened in the evenings, after supper, when the work was done, and the cold had settled outside, and the lamp threw its particular circle of light across the kitchen table. They were not social conversations, exactly. They were practical. The next day's work, the condition of the pasture, the question of whether the east fence line would hold through winter, but practical conversations, held consistently over time, accumulate their own weight. He found himself noting things during the day that he wanted to tell her in the evening. The large ewe who'd been limping, who was fine now. The tracks in the upper pasture that suggested a predator in the area. Small things. The kind of things you tell someone when you have gotten into the habit of telling them things. One evening in December, she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Ask," he said. "Why did you stop?" she said. "At the courthouse. You weren't there for the auction. You were going somewhere." He thought about it. It was a fair question, and it deserved a fair answer. "My wife," he said. "Her name was Margaret. She died in '79. Fever in the spring. Quick, 3 days from sick to gone." He looked at the lamp. "We had a place in Montana before this one. The sheep ranch it was a new start. After." He paused. "I've been making new starts for 4 years without ever quite arriving somewhere." Winifred was quiet, listening with the fullness of her attention, which was one of her qualities. She did not listen the way some people do, preparing the next thing to say. She listened like she meant it. "I stopped," he said, "because you were standing at the end of that row with your arms at your sides and your chin up, and you looked like someone who has already decided to survive whatever comes next and is just waiting to find out what it is." He paused again. "I have not met many people who look like that." Winifred looked at the table for a moment. "My mother used to say that a woman who waits to be rescued will wait her whole life," she said. She said it so often I think she was saying it to herself more than to me. A brief pause. "I learned the posture before I knew what it was for." "What was it for?" She looked up at him. "For this maybe," she said. "For situations where the posture is all you have to work with." Gideon looked at her for a long moment. He thought about Margaret. He thought about 4 years of making new starts. He thought about the particular arithmetic of loneliness, which is that you can get very good at managing it and still not enjoy it. "You could stay," he said, "through spring if you wanted. There's work enough and the outbuilding is dry." "Through spring," she said. "Not a question. Processing. And beyond that," he said, "if the arrangement suited." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What kind of arrangement?" He looked at her steadily. "A permanent one," he said, "if you'd want that." "You don't know me well enough for permanent," she said. "I know you mended the east fence without being asked," he said. "I know you waited for Soot instead of reaching for him. I know you told me your husband was reliable before you told me you loved him, and that told me more about you than the rest of it." He paused. "I've been watching how a person does work for 30 years, and I know something about what that tells you." She was quiet for a long time. The lamp burned. Outside, the wind moved across the roof. "I'd want that," she said finally, "on the condition that the land is in both names." He looked at her. A moment passed. "Done," he said. What happened after was the kind of thing that does not make for a dramatic telling, but makes for a life. Gideon went to the county clerk in January and put the property in both names, Marsh and Hale Marsh, which the clerk noted with the neutral efficiency of a man who has recorded stranger things. Winifred signed the document with her full name, Winifred Beatrice Hale Marsh, which was the first time in 4 years she had signed anything that meant anything. The spring came hard that year and then relented, the way Wyoming springs do. 2 weeks of ice and then a single day of sun that breaks everything open at once. The sheep came through winter better than Gideon had managed alone the 2 years prior. Winifred said this was partly the feed management and partly the east fence and partly Soot, who was, in her opinion, the most competent individual on the property, which Gideon did not dispute. She expanded the kitchen garden in spring, added a section for medicinal herbs that Clara Whitmore, the rancher's wife 6 miles east, had been trying to grow for years without success. Winifred came over in April and spent 2 afternoons showing Clara the soil preparation and the drainage arrangement, and by June Clara had more chamomile than she knew what to do with, and Clara told the women at church. And by August Winifred had become the person the neighboring ranches sent for when something growing wasn't going right, which she accepted with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone doing what needs doing. She also began to teach. There was no school within 9 miles of the property, which meant the children of the outlying ranches learned at home or not at all. 3 families asked Winifred, after Clara mentioned that her father had been a teacher, and that the ability sometimes carries. And Winifred said she had never taught formally. But she knew what she knew, and on Wednesday afternoons 6 children came to the ranch house kitchen table, and she taught them what her father had taught her, which was reading and figures and the particular discipline of paying attention to what is actually in front of you, rather than what you expected to find. Gideon came in one Wednesday in September, the first September in 5 years that had not felt like a new start so much as a continuation of something already underway, to find the kitchen full of children, and the table covered in slates and Winifred at the head of it with the composed authority of someone who has always known somewhere that this was one of the things she was for. He stood in the doorway for a moment. She looked up and met his eyes across the room. She did not smile exactly, but her expression shifted, a brief adjustment, the way a face changes when it recognizes something it is glad to see. Then she went back to the children. He went out to the barn and stood in the good smell of hay and warm animals and thought about $3. He had $3 left in his coat pocket on that October Friday in Redbone, and he had spent all of them on a woman who had looked at him from across a courthouse yard with the expression of someone prepared for whatever came next. He had thought, at the time, that he was doing something practical, filling a gap in the ranch operation, solving a problem that had become unwieldy. He understood now that he had not been practical. He had been lucky. There is a difference, and most people spend a long time learning it. He had learned it in a courthouse yard on a cold Friday morning when a woman with creekwater eyes picked up her bag and said, "Where?" with the directness of someone who has already decided to meet whatever answer is coming. He had said north, and she had nodded once, the nod of someone who has evaluated the available information and committed to it, and she had climbed up on the wagon bench and looked at the hills as if she were already learning them. He had $3 in his pocket that October morning. He had spent every one of them. He had not regretted a cent.